Sun Wukong begins as a curious, fearless figure who refuses to accept the boundaries of the world around him. Over time, that refusal turns into something much larger. He gains strength, ability, and freedom beyond anything normal, until even heaven itself struggles to contain him. But eventually, power without direction runs into something it can't overcome. This is the story of the Monkey King, not just as a myth, but as a reflection of something more familiar. Can power exist without discipline? Power usually expects obedience. Kings expect loyalty. Gods expect worship. Entire systems are built on the assumption that authority should not be questioned, that structure only works when people accept their place within it. For the most part, that holds things together. It creates stability. It creates predictability. It creates something that feels controlled. But every culture also tells stories about someone who refuses to accept that structure, someone who looks at the system and decides it does not apply to them. In Chinese mythology, that figure is Sun Wukong, the Monkey King. His story does not begin as something serious or threatening. It begins with curiosity, with movement, with a kind of restless energy that does not feel dangerous at first. But over time, that energy becomes something else entirely. Because Sun Wukong does not simply question authority, he refuses to recognize it. And the story that follows is not just about rebellion, but about what happens when power grows in a direction that has no structure to guide it. Sun Wukong does not come from a royal lineage, and he is not placed into the world with purpose already defined for him. He emerges from a stone, something that should be lifeless, something that should not contain anything at all. When the stone breaks open, he steps into existence already different from everything around him. That difference matters because it means he does not begin inside a system. He is not shaped by expectations in the same way others are. From the beginning, he exists outside of structure, before he ever decides to challenge it. He joins a group of monkeys and quickly distinguishes himself, not through force, but through boldness and awareness. He takes risks others avoid. He tests boundaries others accept. And over time, that willingness to act becomes something the others follow. He becomes their leader, not because he was meant to, but because he behaves differently enough to stand apart. For a while, that could have been enough. He has status, control, a place where his actions matter. But something interrupts that stability, and it is not external pressure or conflict. It is a realization. He begins to understand that everything in the world eventually ends. Life does not continue indefinitely. Strength fades. Position disappears. Even the most powerful figures are eventually replaced. And that thought does not pass through him the way it might for others. It stays with him. It reshapes how he sees everything else. Because once you realize that everything is temporary, it changes what value those things hold. It makes power feel limited. It makes achievement feel incomplete. And for most, that becomes something they accept, something they learn to live with. But Sun Wukong does not accept it. He decides to challenge it directly. That decision marks the true beginning of his transformation. He begins searching for a way to overcome death itself, not symbolically, not through legacy or memory, but in a literal sense. He wants to remove the limitation entirely. His search leads him to a Taoist master who agrees to train him, but the process is not immediate. It requires time, discipline, repetition, and control. These are not qualities that come naturally to Sun Wukong, but for a time, he learns them. He studies magic, transformation, and movement. He develops abilities that separate him from everything around him. He learns how to change form, how to move vast distances instantly, how to manipulate the world in ways that normal beings cannot. Over time, his power grows to the point where he is no longer simply different. He becomes something outside the category of everything else. This transformation continues when he acquires the staff, a weapon that reflects his growing ability to control scale itself. It can shrink to the size of a needle, or expand into something massive enough to crush anything in its path. The staff is not just a tool. It represents the fact that Sun Wukong no longer operates within fixed limits. He can adjust the world around him to match what he needs it to be. At this point, he has achieved something most figures in mythology spend their entire stories pursuing. He has strength, freedom, and the ability to exist outside the constraints that define everything else. This is where his story begins to escalate, because power that exists without resistance does not remain stable. It continues to expand. It continues to test itself. It continues to push against whatever is in front of it. And eventually, that brings Sun Wukong to the attention of the heavenly court. At first, he is not treated as a threat. He is treated as something that can be managed. The system attempts to absorb him rather than confront him. This is how authority often responds to disruption. Instead of destroying it, it tries to give it a place within the structure. Sun Wukong is offered a position in heaven, a title that is meant to acknowledge his ability while keeping him contained. For a moment, this could have worked. Recognition often stabilizes rebellion. It gives it a role. It gives it direction. It transforms it into something functional. But Sun Wukong sees through the offer. He recognizes that the position is symbolic, that it does not reflect the power he actually has. And instead of accepting it, he rejects it openly. This is the moment where the story shifts from independence into direct conflict. Because now he is not just outside the system, he is actively challenging it. He declares himself equal to the gods, not metaphorically, but literally. And that creates a problem the system cannot easily resolve. It cannot absorb him, and it cannot ignore him. So it moves to stop him. The armies of heaven attempt to bring him under control, but they operate within structure. They rely on hierarchy, on coordination, and on predictable methods of action. Sun Wukong does not. He adapts constantly. He transforms. He moves in ways that cannot be anticipated. And that unpredictability makes him almost impossible to contain. He defeats opponents who should be stronger than him, not through brute force alone, but through his refusal to follow any established pattern. For a time, it appears that he cannot be stopped. He escapes every attempt to capture him. He disrupts the order of heaven itself. And this creates the illusion that power without limits is sustainable, that someone can exist entirely outside of structure and continue to succeed. But that moment does not last, because eventually, something appears that operates on a different level entirely. Buddha does not approach Sun Wukong the way the others do. He does not attempt to overpower him or chase him. Instead, he presents a challenge that exposes something deeper. He asks Sun Wukong to leap beyond the limits of his hand. Confident in everything he has become, Sun Wukong accepts. He leaps across what he believes to be the entire universe, reaching a point he assumes is beyond all boundaries. He marks it as proof of his success. But when he returns, he realizes he never left. He was still within Buddha's hand the entire time. That moment reveals something his power could not account for. Not a stronger force, but a broader understanding of what limits actually are. Buddha traps him beneath a mountain, not as an act of brute force, but as an act of containment. And this is where the story slows down. Everything before this moment is movement, growth, escalation. This is stillness. Sun Wukong, who has always defined himself through action and expansion, is forced into a position where he cannot move at all. This stillness is not just physical, it is reflective. It removes the ability to continue outward and forces him to remain within the consequences of what he has become. This is where the story becomes something more familiar. Because the issue is not just rebellion or authority, it is what happens when something grows without structure. At first, that kind of growth feels like freedom. It feels like breaking past limitations, like expanding into something larger. But without anything to guide it, that growth becomes unstable. It loses direction. It continues to move, but without a clear purpose. And eventually, it runs into something that does not operate the same way. Sun Wukong's imprisonment represents that moment. not the destruction of his power, but the point where it is forced to confront its own lack of direction. Over time, that changes him. When he is eventually released, he is not weaker. He still possesses everything he had before. But now it exists within a structure, within a purpose that directs his actions instead of allowing them to expand without limit. This shift is the resolution of the story. Sun Wukong becomes a protector, a companion to the monk Xuanzang, guiding him on a journey that requires both strength and discipline. His abilities remain, but they are no longer used for chaos. They are directed towards something that moves forward rather than outward. And that distinction is what the story ultimately explores. Because the question is not whether power is dangerous, it is whether power can exist without something guiding it. The answer the story gives is that it cannot. Without structure, power does not remain stable. It becomes something that cannot sustain itself. It either collapses inward or expands outward until it encounters something it cannot overcome. And that is where the story connects beyond mythology. People push against limits all the time, sometimes for valid reasons, sometimes because those limits are real constraints that need to be questioned. But there is a difference between questioning boundaries and removing all boundaries entirely. When everything becomes something to break through, something to outgrow, something to move beyond, it becomes harder to recognize when something is necessary for direction. And that is where instability begins. Sun Wukong's story does not argue against freedom. It shows what happens when freedom exists without discipline. It shows how power, when left without structure, does not simply remain power. It becomes something that cannot settle, something that cannot hold itself together over time. And the resolution is not the removal of that power, but the introduction of something that gives it form. In that sense, the story is not about rebellion or authority at all. It is about balance, about understanding when to push against something and when to allow something to guide you. Because without that distinction, movement becomes directionless. And once that happens, power is no longer something that can be used. It becomes something that eventually must be contained. That is what the story leaves behind. Not a warning about defiance, but a reflection on what happens when strength grows without restraint, and what it takes to bring it back into something that can move forward.